So we've had a little bit of exploration into the instrument families. Now we're going to look closely at the instruments in the orchestra. And we're going to see if we can get a little bit more familiar with some of the sounds that these instruments make. It's one thing to see a picture of an instrument and be able to identify it, and it's quite another thing to hear the sound of an instrument and know exactly what it is. So we are going to get ready to play a game in which we do just that. Before we get to that, let's take a little bit of time to hear the sounds of the instruments in an orchestra. So an orchestra is an ensemble or a group of musicians who play together. Okay? By the way, the main difference between a band and an orchestra is that the orchestra uses string instruments, whereas a band or a wind ensemble does not use string instruments. Just for your information. Let's listen to some instruments of the string family, but the orchestral string family. So not strumming string instruments, but bowing string instruments. You know many of these quite well, and I imagine that you're going to recognize the sound of this instrument right away. So that was the violin, and the violin is the smallest of these instruments, therefore it has the highest sound, and you really heard the upper register of that instrument right there. Next is the viola. I wish I could play that. I'm really not very good at the bowed instruments, but maybe one day I'll get better. So the viola is a bit bigger than the violin, so it has a little bit of a lower sound. Next is the cello. So the cello is even bigger than the viola, and you're really starting to hear a lot of the deep end of the string family here. And the lowest of them is the double bass. That example from the double bass is a little bit more in the style of jazz music. So not bowing, but actually plucking the way a jazz player would. However, you can still hear that it's quite low. And if you've ever seen a double bass in person next to the instrumentalist, you know, usually the double bass is going to be bigger than the person playing it. They're really big. The harp. The harp is another string instrument of the orchestra, but it's not a bowed one. I bet you're familiar with the sound of a harp. So I guess maybe sometimes if you're hearing a harp, it might be hard to tell the difference between that and a strum or plucked string instrument, but I think that the quality or the timbre of the harp sound is very easy to identify. Let's listen to some instruments in the woodwind family. That, my friends, was a flute. One quick note about the flute. A lot of my 5th grade friends tend to say the word flute when what they actually mean is recorder. So just remember that a recorder is something that you're going to play in an up and down position with the instrument, whereas the flute is something that you're going to play off to the side. Okay? Now the flute in the recorder, it might actually be hard to tell the difference in the actual sound, but most of the recorders that you're probably hearing are made of plastic, whereas flutes are made of metal. So, you know, you might be able to hear a little bit of a difference that way. Here's the oboe. oboe is a reeded instrument that we call a double reed just because of the shape of its reed, and it's relatively small, so it makes a pretty high sound. Let's listen to another double reed instrument. That instrument is called the bassoon. So like the oboe, it's a double reeded instrument. So a bassoon kind of sounds like an oboe, but because it's a lot longer and a bit wider around, it's going to have a lower sound. Next, let's listen to a clarinet. I love the clarinet so much. Clarinet is an example of an instrument that uses a reed, but it's not a double reed, just a single pretty flat reed. And the clarinet has a really wide range of pitches. It doesn't go very low though. There are bass clarinets, there are double bass clarinets, so this is a good point for me to tell you that you're just seeing a bit of a snapshot of some of the sizes available for these instruments, or the voicings. So a really good way of demonstrating this is with a saxophone. There are many sizes of woodwind instruments, and here you see an alto saxophone and a tenor saxophone. There's also a soprano saxophone, and there's also a baritone saxophone. So all saxophones are going to be using a single reed, but depending on the size and the shape of the instruments, they're going to sound high or low. So here's an example of a relatively high, or an alto saxophone. And here's a tenor saxophone, which will make a lower sound. Here's some instruments of the brass family. Again, this isn't a complete list, but it is going to be representative of the instruments that you would find in the orchestra. Trumpet's probably pretty familiar to you. Next is the French horn, which is a little bit lower. Next is the trombone, which is a bass brass instrument. One way you can tell a trombone is by listening for the sound of the sliding pitch. So the trombone is an instrument that has this part called the slide, where you can extend the length of the instrument by reaching out with your arm and shorten it this way. And the slide allows the brass instrument to do what's called a glissando, or a slide between notes. So instead of going from here to here, I could go from here with like a little bit of a stretching out, like a taffy sound. So listen for that as you hear the trombone. Did you recognize that piece of music? It's just a little snippet of something familiar. Did you hear the slide? So keep the sliding sound in mind as you hear the next instrument, which is going to be a tuba. Remember, tuba and trombone are both bass instruments. Tuba's the biggest, it's going to be the lowest, but maybe it's going to be challenging to determine if you have a tuba or a trombone. So we want to get as many tools as we can to help us identify. Here's the tuba sound. Here's some instruments of the percussion family that you would find typically in the orchestra. Again, it's not all the instruments of the percussion family, just some of them. A triangle, cymbals, a quick note about that. What you heard was the sound of cymbals in a kind of in a drum kit, like this right here, what I'm pointing at. It's called the hi-hat, where there's two cymbals and they are arranged vertically and they go like this. The picture you're seeing is for cymbals that are free cymbals that you would crash together like that. They make a slightly different sound, but they are the same instrument. So just something to keep in mind there. Let's keep going. The chimes. The xylophone, which many of you have probably played. The next three are all drums, but they have very different sounds from each other. The snare drum is probably very familiar to you as well. Did you hear the drum roll in there? So cool. The bass drum. All right, and then the timpani is a really cool drum that you can tune to an actual pitch and change the pitch of. Let's listen to the timpani. Very dramatic sound. Now the keyboard instruments, keyboard is kind of its own family, and it describes the way that the performer plays the instrument, but it might not refer to how the sound is produced with this instrument. So here the piano is a percussion instrument because there's a hammer striking a string. The harpsichord so dramatic. The harpsichord is considered mostly a string instrument rather than percussion because there's a little piece inside of the instrument that plucks the string. And the celesta. Ooh, what a mysterious chord there at the end. So friends, I hope that you feel a little bit more confident about the sounds that go with specific instruments, and you're going to remember some of those so that we can play a game. Let's do it.